Howdy, folks. Today we're diving into the world of long exposure cityscapes and uncovering the real reason some photographs turn into best-selling prints right after this. Welcome to Camera Shake, where we bring you the insider scoop on all things photography and videography, giving you a unique opportunity to stay ahead of the curve. We've spent literally hundreds of hours interviewing some of the most renowned photographers of our time, giving you access to knowledge and expertise you won't find anywhere else. As always, I'm your host, Kirsten Nuts, and before we get stuck in, make sure you join the Shake Squad, our newsletter crew, over at camerashakepodcast.com. We've got some awesome things coming up, so you definitely want to be on that list. And hey, if you enjoy the show and want to support what we do, you can buy us a coffee over at buymeacoffee.com/camerashake. No pressure at all, but it really does help us create even more exciting episodes for you. I don't know why I keep saying us, it's really just me. So there you go. And I love coffee. Anyhow, so without further ado, let's give it up for today's special guest, the master of the cityscape, none other than Mr. Craig Alexander. Craig, man, good to have you on the show.
Thank you so much. Good to have you. I love that intro. That was great.
Fantastic. Well, I guess this podcast is known for its intros. And my hope is at least, people listen that far. Then that's good. Craig, before we went live, you've already told me that you spend some of your time living in the UK. So you lived in the US and in the UK and in France, I believe.
I'll give you a 33-year-long story in 20 seconds. I was born in Florida. I grew up in the south of France, partially in Nice on the Mediterranean. Oh, no, it's 9 years old. I convinced my mom to send me to boarding school in England, about 45 minutes outside of London in West Sussex. I graduated from high school in England. I moved back to the U.S. I've since lived and worked in 15, 20 different countries, and I'm in Los Angeles right now.
So how did that, that multi-country or multicultural upbringing, did that shape your sort of relationship with cities? Because I'm guessing, growing up in the US and then seeing, cities and towns in the south of France must feel very different.
Yeah. My grandfather was a polyglot. He spoke 14 languages fluently. And my father was American, mother was English. So I had a lot of exposure to a lot of different places early on. And I noticed no matter where I was, people loved their hometown. People loved their home city, and it meant a lot to them. It was kind of like a symbol that really, defined who they were and made a mark on their soul. And I was working in interior design in my late teenage years, and I noticed that people would ask, "Do you have a picture of my hometown, some obscure place in the middle of nowhere?" And so I would start going on road trips to get those photos for them. And long story short, 8 years of failure trying to make that happen and make that a career. When I was 26 years old, after, a dozen or two failed shows, I finally made that a career, opened 4 art galleries in Nashville, Tennessee, and sold over $1.6 million in photography prints. And what I think I'll do for the rest of my life.
Was there like a particular moment or like, or even like, a single image where you realized, this is what I would like. This is the style of photography that I want to pursue.
Yeah. I don't know. Am I able to share my screen here?
I think you might be able to.
Okay. Well, let's give it a shot. If the thing blows up, we'll know we can't. So here's a picture I took when I was.
I tell you, if you can't, then you can send me the picture and I can fly it in YouTube afterwards. No problem.
Okay. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Let's do that. So yeah, I'll send it in afterwards. So this picture here was of Nashville, Tennessee. I took this in the summer of 2013, and it completely changed my life. It's a beautiful long exposure sunset of the skyline with the river below, shot from a bridge at the very end of sunset. And I had business people coming in there, asking, "Can I get this bigger? Can I get this 4 times as big?" And the enthusiasm I saw for that picture put a twinkle in my eye, and that ruined the next 7 years of my life, quality of lifestyle, because I quit my high-paying job and I went all in on photography and failed until 6-7 years later, I finally did succeed in making it career full time. But yeah, that was the Nashville skyline. I call it Nashville Skyline Navy because it was the first one I ever shot of it, and it's navy blue. And yeah, changed my life.
I've just realized something. I'm actually going to be in Nashville in January. Yes, I'm going to
Oh,
be there.
wow.
Yeah, I'm going to be there for Imaging USA. That's right. So, so yeah, I'll be able to see the skyline for myself. Awesome.
Yeah. Go to the middle of the, I'm going to forget the last name, colloquially called the pedestrian bridge. Go to the middle of the pedestrian bridge, right off of downtown Broadway, Nashville. Halfway across the pedestrian bridge at the end of sunset and look across. You can't miss it.
Oh, fantastic. Amazing. Incidentally, if any of you listeners or viewers happen to be at Imaging USA in January, don't be shy. Come and say hello. It'd be amazing. Um, what were your biggest sort of artistic influences when you first picked up a camera? Did you when you first picked up the camera did you immediately know you wanted to photograph landscapes or cityscapes, or did you sort of experiment with different things initially?
That's a great question. My stepfather was a photographer, a professional photographer, and I never learned during my teenage years. But I loved art. I love creativity, and I saw him photograph. I never really like he'd give me a few lessons here and there, but it was actually in high school that I was flunking out of art class, and I was getting solid C's and D's, and the art teacher was kind of trying to pressure me into dropping out of the class because I was bringing the average over grade low because I was terrible at drawing and painting, and with 3 months of the semester left, I kind of discovered photography and long exposure photography specifically, and I kind of saved the day and ended up getting a B. And it was always in the back of my mind that I was a photographer. And when I was like 19, 20, with all these clients of mine in interior design asking, do you have anything of my hometown? Do you have anything of this place? And I started going on late. I'd work 75, 80-hour weeks, 7 days a week, but I'd get off work at around 9:30 p.m. And I'd go on these like late night escapades to photograph these places, and I'd get their number, and then I'd text them and say, hey, come back, I've got the picture. And that's kind of how I made my first sales. But I've always loved photography. And yeah, so good.
I I read in your on your website that you mentioned Ansel Adams as as an inspiration. Now I love Ansel
Yeah.
Adams' work. In fact, I went to see his place in Yosemite a few years ago. Um, and so the you know the that kind of landscape work, I have a lot of respect for that. Although I self-admittedly am a terrible landscape photographer. I just say that now. Um, what aspects of Ansel Adams' work were your main inspiration?
I love I love this question. Ansel Adams, I first saw him when I was about 7 or 8 years old. The Wi-Fi had gone out in my house, and I had a Mac laptop hand me down. This was right around the switch of OS 9 to OS 10. It was a huge change, and so there was no Wi-Fi in the house. I had nothing to do on like a Saturday or something, and I was browsing through like all the different menu options on the entire computer, and just trying to like find something to do. Right on Windows, you have Pinball and Minesweeper. You don't have that on a Mac, no built-in games. So I'm like this 8-year-old like flipping around, and I find the default Apple Mac screensavers, and there was this unbelievable picture from. It's seared into my mind. I'll never forget it for the rest of my life. It was an Ansel Adams picture of Death Valley in Southern California,
Right.
and it was black and white, high contrast. You can probably pull the picture out. Striking dune with this curved line. I was just like, it looked like a different planet. And then there's also the salt flats outside Salt Lake City. And anyway, I kept seeing the name Ansel Adams, and that really made an impression. And so years later, I started looking up Ansel Adams, and just the contrast, the black and white pop, the oomph, I thought a lot of pictures of the era in the 90s, early 2000s were very bland and very low contrast, shot in the middle of the day. Ansel Adams, 80 years beforehand, had figured out this just otherworldly contrast that just popped and made you stare at it. And I was like, if I ever become a photographer, I want to have that effect on people. And hopefully I have.
It's an interesting thing because I had exactly the same sort of experience with Ansel Adams' work, actually. And you're absolutely right. So, when I grew up, when I was, little in the 80s and, throughout the 90s, um,
Yeah.
you're right. Black and white images were kind of bland, almost low contrast and like not very daring, let's put it this way. And I found the same thing in portraiture. And so, just like you, my dad was a photographer, my grandmother was a photographer as well. And I remember seeing some of her black and white portraiture that she shot in the late 30s, early 40s. And the interesting thing about that was these images were incredible. They were really contrasty, they were sharp as heck. They looked like modern pictures for all intents and purposes. But at that time, they were already like 50 years old or something. And
so kind of like golden age of Hollywood, kind of glamour,
yes,
glamour 30. I know the look exactly. I love that. That was when I became a portrait photographer. That was the first look I ever tried to emulate.
yeah, and so this is really how I got into. I'm a huge George Hurrell fan. That's the kind of look that I love, and so I think quite automatically, even when it comes to landscapes, I'm really I'm always drawn to punchy. I call him daring, because he really, you what's the word? Um, it's hyper realism almost. You just gives him punch, and I quite like that. Um, which is why I always have this I have this. It's not a love hate relationship. It's more a struggle with the kind of painterly look in portraiture, for example, because I love that look too. It's a very cool look. Um, But whenever I give myself permission to create an image like that, I'm always drawn to the higher contrast, like and the punchiness. The minute I need to take the saturation out of anything, I'm like, there's there's like something in my head that goes, "Don't do it, don't do it."
It violates your religion, your visual, artistic, spiritual religion. Yes, I totally know what you mean.
Yeah, it's a weird thing. Um, Now,
Yeah, I remember I had a client when I was like 21 or 22. He's like, "Can you do a pastel look?" And I was like, "I can, but like, oh my gosh, I don't want to."
yeah, exactly. That's the thing. With like large volume work, especially like events, for example, I had to really teach myself not to completely, not necessarily over edit, but because the thing is like with events, because you're delivering high volumes, time is money, and so the more time I spend editing something, the less money I make ultimately, because I spend more time on it, and so it's although I don't dislike shooting events necessarily, I don't do a terrible lot of it anymore, but now it's more about workflow and speed of delivery rather than I mean, I remember I used to shoot conferences and I used to edit every image, and we're talking like there was a delivery of 1,200 shots or something. It was insane. I never made
Oh,
money.
my ears were bleeding hearing that, but I was there at 4 a.m, like,
Yeah, yeah,
to
yeah.
get my beat shots, and it was a $300 job because I was in my
Yes.
early 20s, and I was like, every picture will be newly edited, no copy paste settings from Lightroom, like everything must be exact. So I hear you.
Exactly. And and then they used three out of the 1,200 I've just delivered. Unbelievable. Um, Now there was an interesting thing I read about you. You use a lot of um antique lenses, so vintage lenses. What's that? What draws you to those lenses in particular, as opposed to like modern
I was
ones?
broke. I was totally broke. So I was making six figures in an interior design job when I was about 18, 19 years old. I was making lots of money. And when you're making lots of money, you spend lots of money. And I bought cool camera gear, but I didn't invest in lenses. And then I sold, I remember it was like April or May 2013, and I sold my first two pictures on a Saturday morning. And then I sold like another five over the next 2 days. And then over the next 2 or 3 months, I sold a few $1,000s in photography. And I was just like, forget my career in design. I am an artist. I'm a photographer. I'm quitting my job. And I started doing art shows, and I was terrible at them. And I failed, and I failed, and I failed. And there's little slivers of hope. There's like, there's some good response here and there. But then like I'd get reined in, or the stuff would get damaged in transit, or I'd go to a bad show and lose everything, and then have to like crawl back with my tail between my legs to my old boss, or a partner of my old boss, and be like, "Can I get my job back?" I was quite good at it before I arrogantly left. And in that 6 years, I was sleeping on couches, sleeping on blow up mattresses. When there's a hole in the blow up mattress, and you find yourself at 2 a.m. sitting on
Oh,
hard, cold floors, blows back
Totally
up,
been there.
and then you fall again.
I've been there. I've totally
Meanwhile,
been there.
all your friends are getting their first apartments and getting engaged and getting their first BMW, and I'm like, why do I suck at life? And during that time, I had a friend of mine who's a musician. He's doing very well now, but I had Thanksgiving dinner with him last night. But 13 years ago, he goes, there's this thing called Canon FD lenses where you can get $500 to $1,000 quality lenses for $50 on eBay.
Oh.
Yeah, for like $50. So I got it was Canon's lens lineup in the 70s and 80s. They're called FD lenses. F like frog, D like Derek. And I looked on eBay, and you could get like super high quality sharp FD lenses, 50 millimeter f1.4 for like $53 and $10 shipping, compared to $500 to $1,000 now. And then I get like an 85 millimeter or 24 millimeter for $140, and that's what I could afford. And the quality was phenomenal. Everything was manual focus, which I loved. It made me feel kind of cool and vintage and different. And the lens flares, on like modern Sony cameras, I love Sony. I've been shooting with Sony my whole career. But with modern Sony lenses, you get these perfect 12-star, perfectly symmetrical glare if you're shooting at a bright light, when you're f16, f22. But with these, they'd be imperfect, and they'd be kind of sporadic and random. And I'll show you a picture of the Brooklyn Bridge here to kind of show you that look. And I was like, whoa, it's imperfect. It's different. I'm the only person that I know that's shooting on this kind of thing. So it kind of became my edge. And somebody would be like about to buy one of my pictures, like, I'll think about it. And I'm like, by the way, do you like old stuff? They're like, yeah, okay, cool. This is a shot on a lens from 1973. And I told the whole story. They're like, oh, it's so cool. And so because of that extra little bit of the story, they'd buy the thing and, keep me from losing my car or losing my house that month. So it stuck with me. And now I've kind of a little bit progressed to more modern lenses. But for the first 6, 7, 8 years of my career, that was my go-to because I had no money.
Hey, let me just jump in real quick to tell you about the amazing sponsor of this episode, Platypod. Platypod offers innovative camera support systems designed to unleash your creativity. With their stable, versatile, and portable solutions, you can capture stunning shots like never before. And I'm not just saying that. As the host of the Camera Shake podcast, I can personally vouch for Platypod's incredible products. They've become an integral part of the show. In fact, I'm surrounded by various Platypod products holding up lights, cameras, microphones, and so on. It's really helped to transform the way I make the show and the way I shoot at home, in the studio, and on location. But don't just take my word for it. Explore Platypod's website at www.platypod.com to discover their range of products, including the Platypod Extreme, Platyball tripod heads, and the brand new handle, of course. Make sure to follow Platypod on Instagram and Facebook at Platypod Tripods for exclusive updates, tips, and giveaways. By choosing Platypod, you're not only investing in your photography, but you're also supporting the Camera Shake Photography Podcast. Thanks again to Platypod, our amazing sponsor. Platypod, where innovation never sleeps. You said you failed and failed and failed at art galleries and at art exhibitions, and then eventually you succeeded. What was that thing that you did differently in order to make it work? Because I think failing is important. It's an important part of learning, as long as you learn from it and then move on to the next attempt, so to say, and then take stock and improve. What was the thing that finally made it work or succeed?
That's a great question. I've literally written 2 books on the subject, so this is not a short subject. But let me try to give you like the shortest answer that still provides value and has meaning, other than like, oh, I just learned from my own mistakes, because that doesn't help anyone. So there's a saying in any field of life, like metaphorically, the entire car has to work to drive down the road, right? You need wheels, you need tires, you need the engine, you need gear shift, you need a steering wheel, you need the ignition, you need the starter motor, you need the chassis. If you don't have an engine can spin all you want, but you need everything to work to get the car down the road. So you could have a Ferrari engine, you could have Pirelli race tires, but if the gear shifter or the transmission doesn't work, there's no forward motion. And that's kind of how I felt in the first 6 years. I came from like an interior design background, which is a fancy name of a furniture store salesman. Wasn't in a furniture store, but like I sold really expensive furniture. And so I was used to talking to people. That was fine. So that was the Ferrari engine. And I took really good pictures that people really liked. That was the Pirelli race tires. But I didn't have anything else. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know what times to open. I didn't know how to present. I didn't know how to get people to arrive. I didn't know how to have the right pictures for the right shows. And like sometimes it's an older demographic, sometimes it's younger, sometimes it's male, sometimes it's female, sometimes they want expensive stuff, sometimes they want cheaper stuff. I was paying way too much for the printing itself. That's one thing I've really prided myself in. I now teach thousands of photographers how to sell their own like prints online. And one of the things I pride myself in the most is I spent 12 years negotiating the best rates in the entire industry for photographers. And then I'm like, oh, you paid $150 for that canvas? I know how to get that for $27, shipping included, drop shipped anywhere in the US. That makes a huge difference. So having that margin, there's a saying, if you don't have a 5x margin in this business, you don't have a business, you have a hobby. And hobbies are great, but when you're underwater in your hobby, it's not a lot of fun. So if you can get the same canvas for $27 instead of $150, that changes all the economics of this venture. And it wasn't about money for me. It was really about the art and connecting with people and inspiring people. But if I didn't have those margins, if I didn't have that markup, I couldn't make anything work. So one of the biggest things is getting those margins down. And I went to mainland China to negotiate with like world-class factories. I went to Canada. I went to the UK. I went in New York. I lived in just north of New York City for about a year. I met all kinds of some of the best factories, multi-billion-dollar factories, and I negotiated deals with their heads of marketing to get really good deals for my students and everything like that. But I'll tell you, all that being true, the one thing that mattered the most is in the business world, they call it product market fit, getting the right pictures for the right people at the right time. For example, I did an art show in Florida a few days after Christmas in 2015. So I was 23 years old. And I just come back from Europe for a month. So I'd photographed Italy, Venice, Paris, Westminster Abbey, Big Ben, Houses of Parliament. I had all these amazing pictures of Western Europe. And I put them on display and I was so proud of them. And, I've been blowing up early Instagram. Everyone was like, oh my God, you're so talented. And nobody cared. It was a beach town in Florida where everybody wanted palm trees. They wanted, white sandy beaches, blue waters, and that kind of thing. And that was a really painful lesson. I remember going home like almost in tears. I was like, I'd spent $1,000 of my last money to do the show with the hope of making the money back. And I didn't even get a single person to even be interested. Not only did I not make a single sale, I didn't get even a single person asking a price or anything like that. They just walked back. I felt anonymous. And I was like, this stinks. I never want to do this again. And that was the day that I really discovered that you got to match the photography with your market. So if you have a bunch of people that you can sell to, you have to figure out what they're already buying. Because you can predict what they will buy in the future by what they've already bought. So if you can find bestseller lists, if you can go to the front page of Google, let's say you're in London, you type in London photography, what's on the front page of Google is a really good tip. Now we have AI, so you can type into ChatGPT, hey, I'm gonna do a big art display in Camden Market in London. What would be the top 5 things that I should photograph that this clientele would like? ChatGPT will give you a bunch of that. You can look on Etsy and Amazon bestseller lists and find what has the most reviews, because if it has the most reviews, it has the most sales. I found on Etsy.com, for example, for every review, on average, there's about 7 sales behind that. So if you find an item with 100 reviews, there's 700 sales. So if you can find one subject matter that has lots and lots of items that have lots and lots of reviews, chances are there's been a history of sales. And if you can find the history of sales, you'll know it will sell in the future. So this kind of product market fit was probably the primary thing, because I go to Nashville and I had Nashville pictures. In Florida, it's Florida, New York City, because there's a bunch of New Yorkers in Florida, Chicago, and Toronto. There are 4 things. But Nashville, in Florida, no one cares about Nashville. In Nashville, no one cares about New York. But in New York, they only care about New York and a little bit about Paris. They like Paris and New York. But you try to show them something from Florida and New York, they're like, get out of here. So matching the audience with what you have was probably the biggest one thing. The second thing would probably be make sure you have like a 5x or a 5 times multiple on what you're selling, get really good deals. And then the third thing is tell really exciting stories. People are attracted to stories. And when they know the story behind your photograph, then they'll buy. Otherwise, they'll just ask prices and walk away.
That's actually, that's very clever. And I never thought about it this way in terms of print sales. The only thing that's kind of similar to that was, I thought about, I was thinking about something, I mean, maybe, within the similar realm the other day, because I was thinking about, I live in London, and London is very photographic when you know where and when to go, because if you're trying to shoot beautiful skies, London's not your place. But there's a lot of architecture. It does look very pretty. There are a lot of hidden places that not necessarily everybody knows. So it's there's some beautiful opportunities in London, and I thought to myself, it would be quite easy to create a portfolio of images in London since I live here. But then I thought, like, well, who's going to buy these images? And as initially I thought, well, everybody loves London. Everybody wants to buy London pictures. But then I thought, well, but if I just sell them to a general audience, that's one thing. But surely if I contacted hotels in London, surely that's almost like a pre-manufactured market, because London hotels will by default want to buy London imagery. Am I wrong in thinking that?
Not at all. You're right on the money. When I was in the Grand Canyon in the US a few months ago, we stopped by, we did like a three stop tour, Sedona, Grand Canyon, Monument Valley. And in every hotel that we stayed at along the way, the exact thing that we were going to be shooting the following morning was up on our wall in the hotel and in the lobby and in the lunchroom and in the breakfast room. You're 100% right. And yeah, 100%.
Cool. Right. I will stop doing this. I'm going to go into town and shoot some London pictures right now.
Okay. You have my number.
Cool. Now, I'm again. I mentioned it earlier. I'm a self-confessed complete loser when it comes to landscape photography. But the one thing that's always fascinating. I'm trying to get better. I think I've improved quite a lot. But the one thing that's always fascinated me is long exposure photography. It's because it's almost like it's like macro photography. You're diving into, you're sort of peeling back a layer that's hidden from the eye normally. It's like with macro photography, you discover things that you just can't see with the naked eye. And with long exposure photography, it's kind of the same thing. You're looking at the same world, but it just presents itself in a completely different way because of the long exposures. So what is it? What does a long exposure shot give you emotionally or aesthetically that a standard shot doesn't?
I love how you have posed that question. You asked great questions, my friend. I love it. I'm a huge nerd. I studied math and physics in high school, and I thought I was going to be an inventor and a physicist. I'd say physician. No, that's a doctor. Physicist, some mathematician. Yeah. And I remember I was reading this biography, and it was like talking about Einstein. There's like the 3 dimensions, and then Einstein claimed that time was the 4th dimension. And I thought, well, if I'm photographing things that everybody has seen before, what's one element that I can introduce to completely make everything completely new? Like, I only want to take photos that have never been photographed before. I never want to put out a photo and then find out someone's done the exact same thing. I want something completely unique. So what element can I bring into photography or my photography that makes that completely unique? And for me, that was long exposure photography, because the eyes, roughly speaking, capture the world at 1/25th of a second. So 25 frames a second. And my camera would capture the world at 30 seconds. 30-second exposures is like my go-to. And so when you're photographing the Nashville skyline when I was, 20 years old, with the naked eye, the water was choppy because there was some wind. With a long exposure, it looked like an ice skating rink. It was completely smooth. And I told myself, wow, I'll bet 99.999% of the population has never seen this exact view with a completely smooth sky. And then the clouds, because they're moving, are completely streaked. So it looks like these streaks of paint across the sky. And it's a view that people see all the time from the news, from movies about Nashville, poor quality postcards. But I'm giving them what they love seeing, what's iconic about it in a completely different way. And then I asked myself, like, am I the first person to, use long exposure photography? Of course not. There's 100 years of Andal Adams and a million other names. But for the things that I was photographing, especially with modern techniques and modern equipment, except for the lenses, I found that long exposure always got that gasp of people like, oh, I've seen this view a million times. I've never seen it like that. And that was kind of like the secret sauce.
There's something beautifully like romantic about that. I was thinking, especially with clouds and water. Same, I've seen images of a beach that I've been to a lot. And of course when I go, there's either stormy or or rains or the one day a year when the sun comes out in this country. Yeah, pretty much. Well, actually, I tell you what, Brighton. Well, yeah, close to Brighton. I tell you what, close to it. So the beach at Brighton, I'm not a big fan of because it's like pebbles and things. I'm not a big pebble beach person. But there's a place close to Brighton called Camber Sands, and it's basically it's sand dunes, and and if you go the right time of year and the right time of day, it's actually a beautiful beach. It's completely overrun if you go like during the school holidays or something, But yeah, at the right time it's beautiful because it's very very wide and very long sand dunes, and it's it's a beautiful place. But it's the same thing, you look at it with the naked eye, and it looks one way, but then if you're there at the right time, like at dawn, or sunset or something like that, you get the light to be right. It's a completely different thing. So I love that. I'm always fascinated with people who shoot cityscapes, especially like in your case. Just one look at your website it's fascinating how many different cities are represented on that. And the thing, and I tell you, I had a conversation with Serge Romelli the other day about a similar thing. The thing I always find fascinating is, like, how do you scout your locations? Like, what is the process before you travel to a city? Because you get travel for quite a distance.
Yeah.
What's your process to actually find those locations?
Okay, so I'll tell you a funny story here. I was shooting a movie with Serge Romelli in early 2022. We were filming a movie. We smuggled a bunch of camera gear through customs in Egypt because they charge like $1,000 or $2,000 a day in permits, and we didn't want to pay the permits. It was like indie film. So we smuggled a bunch of like, consumer looking cameras that were actually like fully pro. We like held them in our jacket. Anyway, it was very, I hope the Egyptian authorities aren't listening to this because I'm going back in 2 months. But we're in Egypt and we're shooting there for 4.5 days around the pyramids. And we're shooting this like science fiction movie about time travel. It was really cool. And I was like, we're in Egypt. I had a really bad cold. It was right in the middle of COVID. So I was like hoping it was not COVID. But and I was in Cairo, Egypt, and I had like seen movies and read encyclopedias, and I'd been a huge Egypt fan as a kid. And I was like, I've got to shoot the 1 or 2 pictures that you absolutely have to shoot when you're in Egypt. How do I get those? And I found that the front page of Google, you type in any subject, say Egypt or Cairo or Egyptian pyramids. Let's just say Egypt, and then you go to the top where it says images. That is the best live representation of the brain of Earth collectively of what people are clicking on, generally speaking. And by looking at the one thing that comes up the most, you type in London, you get the Houses of Parliament, Big Ben, underground signs, red double-decker buses, red telephone boxes. You might get the Beefeaters, the Royal Guards, the Black Hats. You might get Buckingham Palace. These are the icons of that place. So I did that for Egypt. And of course, the pyramids were first, second, and third. The Sphinx was fourth. I think the Nile River with like palm trees and old like ancient sailboats going down the Nile, that was like fifth. So I photographed a couple of these um, because it was based on what was first place in Google Images. And I found through all kinds of scientific breakdown much later, when I got much nerdier about the data, that the front page of Google Images is kind of the who's who of exactly what is atomics in that spot. And I've tried that with these like tiny little desert towns in the western United States, in Nevada, in like tiny little towns in California. The front page of Google Images will show you the most iconic images of that area. The second one thing I like to do is postcard racks. You go to any place and you go to the local tourist trap. What is the most prominent? It's like an analog version of Google Images. You go to London, everything I just described will be on those postcard racks. You go to Paris, guess what? It's the Eiffel Tower, it's the Arc de Triomphe, it's the Gardens of Luxembourg, it's the Seine River, it's the Champs-Elysees, et cetera, the Sacré-Cœur. So postcard racks are the physical analog, equivalent of the front page of Google. And if you really want to keep it really simple, the third way is ChatGPT. Hi, my name is Eric. I'm flying to Copenhagen, Denmark for the weekend. I have an Amazon or an Etsy store where I sell photography prints. Give me the top 5 things that would sell the best in my store. I sell on canvas, paper, acrylic, and metal. Give me the first 5 and tell me how to shoot them. And it'll literally give you like a perfect readout based on millions of pieces of information, all put into simple text for you. And it takes 20 seconds. How's that for a quick summary of a 200-page book?
I mean, it's great. I mean, it makes perfect sense, really, if you think about it. Even just the Google thing makes perfect sense because, these would be, Google would be serving you up the most searched for images. So if they're most searched for, they're therefore... Yeah. And so by default, they would be the most popular ones. And so therefore, they would stand the highest chance. Although the other thing to consider then, of course, on the flip side is competition level. So you have... Then you have images with high competition level, like take the Tower Bridge in London, for example, right? Or the Eiffel Tower in Paris. That then, so then the next level then must be, I'm guessing, to see if you can create some unique images of that location, or does that not matter at all?
Oh, I love how your mind works. I think you and I would be friends off camera. Everything he said is very highly logical. I think there's a slight assumption there that anybody knows what the heck they're doing. And I have found that in selling landscape photography to the world, nobody knows what the heck they're doing. They can be really, really good photographers, but they don't know the first thing about marketing. And you go on Etsy, you go on Amazon, there's no competition. So I started something called the Thriving Artist Academy 4 or 5 years ago. Collectively, we sell $50,000 to $100,000 a month, as a group, online, and often more. I was talking to one of my students 2 days ago, and he just closed a deal with a big development for $40,000 of, or more than $40,000 of print sales to a place in San Antonio, Texas. If you're in Europe, you've probably never heard of that place. Saint America, and nobody knows what they're doing. So if you have good prices and good markup, and you do the basics right, and you have the things that people want, you'll become the go-to source. If you're assuming a mature market where everyone knows what they're doing, yes, there's more competition. But in landscape photography, specifically print sales, when you're selling it to the world, no one knows what they're doing. Have at it. The market's yours.
Huh. Awesome. I might draw a portraiture.
Yeah. Hey, dude. Yeah, we'll talk off screen. I'll give you some tips.
All right.
Or even better, I'll give you a tip right here. Something I found is it pays to be a big fish in a small pond. So if you can take really good photos of like a small place, somewhere way off the beaten track, but the 200,000 people that live there have never seen their town photographed like London, Paris, San Francisco, New York, Chicago, but you're still taking it in that really cool style with long exposure and really, really beautiful shot. By the way, sunrise and sunset photos of the exact same thing will sell 10 to 20 times better than broad daylight.
Well, that's a reason to get up early in the morning, for sure.
Or just sunset, because I don't like waking up early in the morning.
Yeah.
Unless I travel halfway across the world, then I'll wake up early. But otherwise, it's sunset.
You know, that used to be my excuse actually when it came to landscape photography. So, you know, the way I got into photography in the first place, other than it just being a family curse, was, you know, I used to, as a session musician, obviously I used to play, like, I used to play in clubs and, you know, and festivals and whatever. And of course, as a musician, you're up late, you know, you're up until, I don't know, you perform until, I don't know, 1 o'clock in the morning, then you get to pack your stuff up, load the car, go home, unload, blah, blah, blah. So it's like 3, 4 in the morning before you get to bed. That's just normal, right? And you're used to that in a sense. And I think if you're a performing musician, it's that sort of night owlishness, you know, it's probably built in. And so I always used to say, like, I have no problem photographing my friends playing gigs because that's ultimately what I started doing eventually. But
Mm.
I have a real problem with, you know, getting my ass out of bed at like 4 o'clock in the morning in order to sit in a field looking at a tree, you know, to take a landscape picture. And that, to me, that was always initially that was the barrier. And of course, it's just a mental barrier because it really doesn't make a difference. Of course, I can get myself out of bed early in the morning. Of course, I can take the effort or make the effort. And there's a really interesting thing I heard some time ago, and I can't remember who it was exactly, but I think it was a former, I want to say a former Navy SEAL or something. And the conversation was, it was around going to the gym, right? So how do you manage to go to the gym every day at 5 o'clock in the morning? And it's just unbelievable. You know, what's your motivation? And he said, I don't need no motivation. There's no motivation. You know, if I base everything on motivation, I wouldn't get my ass out of bed. It's as simple as that. I get up, I simply do the thing. It's called discipline. And I was like, ah, it's completely right. You know, if you base it on like a motivational, a level, you're gonna go, oh, I'm just not motivated today. But if it's just a matter of discipline, you just go, well, I'm just gonna get out of bed and go to the gym, no matter whether I feel motivated today or not. I'm just gonna do it because it's just as I have breakfast every morning. It's just a thing that I do. Just that, you know, I have to take the dog out every day, whether I'm motivated to or not. Because if I don't, I'm in trouble.
You asked a question that I was almost done answering, and I wanna honor the audience here by just finishing answering the question. Um, he said, how do you stand out when there's a lot of competition? First of all, there isn't really much competition, but also if you shoot, with long exposure and you shoot it at sunrise or sunset, specifically sunset, because that's easier to do. Um, and you also do something called icon stacking. This is a huge cheat code. Write this down, guys, if you've ever wanted to sell your photography. Icon stacking is basically, you can probably only see parts of the picture behind me, but this is part of the Hollywood sign with the Hollywood Hills behind it. And I don't know how much you can see of it, but there's Lake Hollywood in there, and there's the skyline, and there's a beautiful sunset. So there's like 5 or 6 really cool things in the picture. With Nashville, you had the tallest building in Tennessee called the Batman Building. It's called. You got Broadway. You have the river. You have First Avenue. You have the Bridgestone Arena, which is the hockey field, and you have a really cool sky. You have really cool long exposure water. So there's 6 or 7 awesome visual elements. So yeah, if you just photograph a red phone box, it might not sell. If you can get a red phone box and a double-decker bus going by, and you have Big Ben in the far corner, and there's like a horse-drawn carriage as well, you can combine awesome elements that people already love. As you add them into the picture, the sellability of that picture rises exponentially. It's not linear. So like you get 3 icons, you'll double or triple your sales with 4 icons. So getting icons are like famous things that people love that represent an area. Like, if you can get the pyramids of Egypt and the Sphinx and a really cool sunset and a camel, like you're winning the game.
So, are you talking about compositing or just creating a situation where these things are actually in the frame of it?
Like getting in the right position and arranging the elements and getting good at asking favors of total strangers. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a fantastic location just outside of St. Paul's in London, where you have St. Paul's Cathedral in the background, and there's a phone box in just the perfect position. That with a low angle shot, you can get the phone box and you get St. Paul's in the background. And
the one you talked.
yes, exactly, yeah. And then basically, and then you if you time it just right, there's a red double-decker bus line that goes right past it as well. So you can.
I know the
There's a,
exact one you're. Yep,
yeah,
that's a perfect example of icon stacking. Yeah.
yeah. The only problem with that is that at some point they painted that phone box black. So now it's a black London phone box, which I guess that's where Photoshop comes in, I suppose.
There you go. Yeah, generative fill for the wins. Um, you said something funny. You said, "Oh, I love what you said," and I've just lost it for a second. Um, oh yeah, asking favors of strangers. So this is my favorite line. Please feel free to steal this from me. You walk up to somebody if you want them to move or you want them to do a certain thing, especially if they're dressed really cool. You say, "Hello, I have no right to ask this, but I've been dreaming of this picture forever. Is there any way I could ask you for 2 minutes to stand in XYZ position or whatever like that? I have no right to ask this, but I've been dreaming of it. Is there any way you could help me?" Oh my gosh, that works 95% of the time. And you have to mean it, be real. It's not some corny line, like ask it with heart and people will move mountains for you if you ask nicely. And I ask people to move. I ask people to get in. Like if there's like, a guy and a girl in front of a beautiful sunset with like an incredible thing. It's like, oh, could you like hold hands or something or look towards the sunset? And I'm kind of like a film director where the world, the world, occasionally I can get to do my bidding. So I'm like, hey, is there any way? And I'll set up a whole thing and it'll be great. People just love to feel valued and help. So many people want to help others when you can tap into that and also be of service to others as well. Sometimes I'll give them my Instagram and I'm like, great, I'll get you a copy of that picture and you can have it. And they're like, oh, thanks. So now, the help is going both ways. It's really cool.
I think that really does work. When you offer somebody to send them the image afterwards. I know that this is the thing with street photography in London, for instance. You obviously you by default are going to have people in the picture. Some people like it, some people really don't. It always depends on your reaction to it. But what I've found is exactly that. Whenever if we share Instagram accounts or we follow each other, and then I make sure I send them the final shot. Usually that does go a long way. I want to come back to long exposure photography just for a second. Because the thing for me as like one of the uninitiated, in a sense, I always wonder, like, how do you decide when to go for long exposure and when not to? Like, what are these sort of factors that say to you, okay, well, this is the perfect scene for a long exposure shot?
Yeah. I'll answer that in reverse. I went to Kenya, Africa, this April of this year for the very first time. It was amazing, and I got to photograph elephants and lions and leopards and it was just the coolest thing. And so I didn't do much long exposure for animals because they're moving, obviously. But other than that, it is extremely rare. I think there's been like 3 photos in my entire portfolio that are not long exposure. Everything else other than animals are long exposure because there's nothing that you can do with normal photography that isn't enhanced by long exposure as long as the important things aren't moving. Now, when the water's moving and the sky's moving, but the important things are completely still, you get this wonderful contrast. Because if everything's blurry or everything's sharp, it's kind of like whatever. But as you know from like portrait photography, when the foreground's sharp and the background's blurred out, it's so cool and it's so otherworldly and it's not what other people get. So I by default, I shoot long exposure. I usually shoot only at sunrise, sunset. That's the only kind of time that interests me. On the rare times that I shoot in the daytime, I have a 10-stop ND filter that I put in front of the sensor, and I shoot long exposure anyway.
I started doing that in the Lofoten Islands not too long ago, last year.
I'm setting up the tour right now.
Oh, really? Yeah. Okay. Oh man, you will love it. I've been there twice now. Actually, I taught a workshop up there, which is on location lighting, shooting Viking models in their natural habitat, essentially. And yeah, it's a phenomenal location. The thing is, like, we took our our group out. We had a couple of models with us the whole time and a lot of gear in the back of the van, and we took our people out, and wherever you look, I mean, it's actually unreal. You set up your models, for example, you take some shots, then you turn around you take some incredible landscape shots, and then you go like, okay, what what location could we go to next? But you just turn around again, and there's another incredible vista. I mean, it's so easy to find unbelievable scenes there. And to be honest, I mean, you just look down at the water, and you don't need any imagination to imagine, a Viking ship sailing through the fjord. It's all right there. It's unbelievable. It's one of the most phenomenal um landscapes I think I've ever been to. It's incredible. It's an incredible landscape, incredible place. You'll love it.
Love that. I can't wait. Yeah, it'll be I think July 2027. We're gonna do Lofoten for maybe 3 or 4 days.
Okay.
And then pronouncing that wrong, sorry. And then we're going up to Svalbard to photograph polar bears.
Okay.
Nice.
So I give you a tip. I mean, July is not necessarily the best time for Northern Lights because obviously it's the Arctic summer and you need dark skies to.
Yeah, we're optimizing. We're optimizing for polar bears, unfortunately.
Yeah. But if you need a guide up there, I know just the guy. Yeah. Dave Williams is actually probably the world's foremost expert on photographing Northern Lights. But he happens to live in Svolvær in the Lofoten Islands and knows the place like the back of his hand. So I highly recommend him.
Shoot him his Instagram or his email. I'd love to meet him.
Yeah, he's phenomenal. Now, your colors are incredible. So the one thing I notice or take in when I look at your imagery is the colors. And what I particularly love are the sort of the tones and the whole palettes. Basically, how do you decide on a palette, on a color palette for a particular cityscape? What's the sort of decision making process for that?
I've got a controversial take on this. I really don't like modern art. I remember I was with a friend in London this past summer in London, and she's like, "Hey, do you want to go to the museum?" I'm like, "Sure." It's like, "Great, let's go to the Tate Modern on the Thames."
Oh,
and
there you go.
Okay, cool. I love art. Don't particularly like modern art. Occasionally it can be cool, but when it's a banana duct taped to a wall, I'm like, you know what? My dog could have done that. Okay, controversial thing over. And there's a lot of dull colors out there. There's a lot of colors that don't blow your sock off. And I'm like, if I'm gonna bother creating beautiful imagery, why not do it with the most beautiful color possible? And to me, subjectively, bright, highly saturated, highly contrasty, well balanced color is what kind of speaks to me. So early on, way before I knew how to use Lightroom or Photoshop, this is like 2008, as like a 15-year-old with like a little PowerShot Canon 2-megapixel camera with CF cards in them that held 16 megabytes, 32 megabytes. I found that if I balanced my camera up on like a pole or a drinking fountain and photographed a scene at night, it would be much more highly saturated, but it looked natural. It didn't look like you went onto Microsoft Paint and dragged the saturation to 1,000. It looked natural, but highly saturated. And I realized that most scenes with the eye, that really blows you away. Like if you're at the beach and there's this beautiful sunset, most times that you see a beautiful sunset, those colors are highly saturated but natural looking. And I found that long exposures naturally bring a much more saturated and vibrant effect to the world. And so anytime I'm shooting, I'm like, how can I blow the socks off the audience in my own head? With composition, how can I do that with lighting? But how can I also do that with color? And I really like bright colors. And it's present in pretty much all my images, where the colors really explode at you. And I don't turn the saturation up much, like a lot of that. In fact, in that Nashville picture, I had to turn the saturation down.
Yeah. This one of your images, wires on the Brooklyn Bridge. And to me, that really stands out, because it's got this what do you call it, like sapphire and gold theme, type of thing. What was the thing that inspired that treatment, color-wise?
There was a fad in the 1880s called cyanotypes. Cyan is a fancy word for blue, and a type meant a kind of photograph. So you had daguerreotypes, you had, all kinds of different types. Type just meant the kind of photograph. So cyanotype was an alternative to black and white, because back then you only had monochromatic film. You had two tones. And so there's a certain kind of film for a short amount of time that was kind of popular. And instead of black and white, it was blue and yellow. And then later they started developing film that had like red and green. So this was often contrasting colors. The rest of them kind of didn't look good, but there's a lot of old Victorian era photographs that are kind of in that gold and blue. And I love those two colors together. And so I remember I was on the Brooklyn Bridge. I didn't have a tripod at the time, so I balanced a picture on a shoe. That picture was inside of my shoe, and I like used the shoe as a tripod. And the colors were super ugly. The sky was like this purplish mauve, and like lights were this like ugly chemical green looking, and it was a beautiful composition. And the colors were ugly, and of course, a million people. Brooklyn Bridge in black and white is not original. So I'm like, what would be original? How about a cyanotype? And so the digital process is called split toning, where you turn the picture into black and white in, say, Lightroom, and then you make the shadows kind of denim blue sapphire, and then you make the highlights gold. And it's a really good time. Highly recommend it. I tell my students to do it, and they sell really well.
Cool. It just reminded me of something, and I've mentioned this on a number of episodes because it's a piece of software I just totally fallen in love with. It's called Film Pack by DxO, and it's I think it's Film Pack 9 by now. It's a phenomenal piece of software. It basically has all sorts of different classic film emulations, right? But it also has the educational bit built into it, so you can learn about these films and what they would be used for back in the day. And so so it tells you how long that film was in production for, what it was mainly used for, and it tells you who some I don't know, well-known photographers would have used that. And there's another function where you could take your own image and you can literally run it through a timeline, all the way back from, I don't know, 1843 or something to the present day, and you can see what your shot would have looked like had it been shot on all these different, varied types of film, which I think is super fascinating. I mean, being like slightly nerdy when it comes to that, it's super fascinating. But I love that. I love the fact that not only can you get creative, but you can also, at the same time, it's educational. You can learn a lot. Like for somebody like me who's who doesn't I don't really have a lot of experience when it comes to film per se, especially not, I mean, I shoot a little bit on film now, but when it comes to like films from years gone by, I don't really have a lot of historical knowledge when it comes to that. But this is a really great way of educating yourself with that respect.
I love that. That's really cool.
Yeah, it's really fun. And if you can hear that scratching, that's my dog trying to break into this room.
We love dogs. Oh yeah, it's really cool that you brought up Sergio Melli. That you had you did a podcast episode with him.
Yes, it hasn't. That's right. Yeah. So by the time people listen to this, that episode would have already aired, but it has, as we speak, it hasn't aired yet.
No, Serge is amazing. He is a dear friend of mine. We started working together in 2021, and he's just been such an inspiration. First of all, he's such a great human. He's one of the most generous, kind, inspiring people ever. He's one of the most famous photographers in the world today in landscapes and cityscapes. So talented. He's taught me so much. But funny story, I actually went to school with his son in England in 2002.
Oh.
When I was like 9 years old. And we stayed friends on Facebook, and we didn't talk for like 15 years. And I got a random Facebook message when I was doing well in my galleries. I was posting every single picture. When someone would buy something, I'd get a picture of them and me and the picture, and they're holding it, smiling. And they would, they'd be smiling, and everyone was like, "Hey, great job on the sale." And like hundreds and hundreds were like this. And he reached out and he's like, "Hey, do you remember me?" I'm like, "Yeah, I remember you from school." He's like, "It's really cool what you're doing with photography. Would you like to meet Sergio Melli?" I'm like, "Who wouldn't want to meet Sergio Melli?" Like, of course I want to, but like, who's he to you? He's like, "Oh, he's my dad." I'm like, "Wait, what?"
Awesome.
He's like, "Do you want to meet him? Do you want to go on the phone?" I was living in Nashville today. Like, "Do you want to get on the phone?" He just moved from Los Angeles to Florida, and I was from Florida, so he had moved to my hometown where my family was. And a few days later, we got on the phone, we got along really well immediately. And, he's just I can't say enough good things about him. He's such a great guy.
Yeah, it was a super fun conversation. Also, highly educational for me. This is the thing. This is why I love doing this podcast. Is because photography is such a beautiful subject because it's so varied. Um, like the variation or the variety of guests that I've had on the show has been absolutely humbling. Everybody from you know unbelievable, landscape photographers like yourself to, some of the world's leading portrait photographers, or people in the sort of, in the political field, like, White House photographers, for example, or war photographers. All of these different situations require photography, but they're very, very, very different. Some are journalistic in nature, some are artistic, but we are visual creatures, and so therefore, a visual media or visual media, let's say, are super important to us, and so we utilize those in virtually every area of life, in a sense. Everything from like newborn photography, to wedding photography, to photographing portraits of World War II veterans. A friend of mine did a series on that, and it's just I find it super interesting. And for me, I have to say, I'll be totally honest. It's taught me more than any university course could have ever taught me when it comes to photography. Because the reality is, I mean, for me, running this podcast, I get an opportunity to have a conversation with people who are really, really at the cutting edge of, of their game. And I pretty much get to ask them whatever I want to ask them, So it's like,
You're saying this is purely selfish. Let's do this for you. The fact that you record is incidental.
Oh, well, I mean, but this is the thing, though. The truth of the matter is, and I might cut this bit out, but never mind. The truth of the matter really is, people will tell you, oh, I do it for, I do it for the audience, or blah blah blah. The truth of it is, ultimately, I started. Yeah, ultimately, you kind of do it for yourself because, I started doing this at the beginning of the pandemic because all my other photography work had completely disappeared, because it was lockdowns and whatnot. And so I had to do something creative. And so I thought, this sounds like a good idea. Let's do that. And it keeps me busy every week. And, very, very, very quickly, I mean, literally within weeks, I realized, you know what? This is super fun. And I love doing this because I think I had like 2 or 3 guests on the show initially, and then I thought, like, I've learned a ton. This is great, And so the hope is of course that, that people who are listening to it, or watching it on YouTube have the same experience, and have these takeaways. Even if within, an hour and a half of a conversation, there are 1 or 2 takeaways, that somebody goes like, oh, I didn't know this, or like, that's pretty incredible. Like, for instance, I mean, you talk to somebody whose specialism is, I don't know, photographing the inside of volcanoes or something, and you go, how do you do that? Yeah, I mean, it's like nuts. Or yeah, talking to Barack Obama's White House photographer, and you kind of go, okay, so what was that like? Being in the Situation Room with Barack Obama and and his whatever, his generals, something, when the Osama bin Laden raid was going on. Because it's a famous picture, and you go like, well, how do you shoot that picture? Like, when and I'm not being political at all, but what I'm saying is, when you're in a situation like that, as a moment that's really truly a moment in history, so to say, how do you keep it together to be focused enough on on doing a job when all of that's going on around you? And same with war photography. I find it insanely fascinating. Like, when you're under fire, or you have to make decisions like, am I going to help this guy who's just been shot by a sniper and lies dying in the street, or am I going to help him, or am I going to take his picture and let the rest of the world know what's going on? It's one of these things where sometimes, you have to think to yourself, well, how would I react? How would I deal with that situation? And so it's insanely interesting, to talk to people who have those kind of experiences. It's, it's nuts.
Totally. That's the moral dilemma. It's like you got me thinking there. Wow, don't know that I'd want to be there.
Yeah, so Stefano Tomalo, I had on the show, and he there's a famous picture of his, a black and white shot of a guy, a civilian, who I believe it was in Iraq, who had been shot by a sniper just in the street, and you know, and it was literally this split. I mean, this split second thing. Well, first of all, the sniper must still be out there. So if you go out and you take that picture, you put yourself into danger, and you get kids and wife and family at home. And you kind of, is it worth that? That's one question. But the other thing is, you could also think, well, I could now go help that guy, and potentially save his life, or I could take that picture and literally let the rest of the world know what's actually happening here.
Yeah.
In order to prevent more death in the future or whatever. And these are decisions like, it's virtually impossible to predict how you would react yourself, unless you're or until you're in a situation like that. And that's, I find it, really interesting. Incidentally, when I asked him, because he was back in New York, I think, and he said like, oh, I haven't really been in any conflict zone for a few years because of the kids and stuff. And I said, so if you got a call now, would you go?
So like Ukraine or Middle East.
Yeah, exactly. Because there's always places like that, And he just looked around and he goes, "Yeah, I think I would." And that's like, wow. I mean,
Wow.
it's unbelievable. Anyhow,
Yeah.
on that somber note, I think one of the things that photographers ask themselves a lot, especially people who are thinking about selling prints, is, I think the first question would be, where do those buyers come from? Like, do they come from art galleries? Do they come from, I don't know, social media? I think a lot of people think like, oh, if I just put my images on social media, surely that's, just be seen and then they will come. Um,
Yeah.
what's the thing that you think most photographers misunderstand about the
Yeah.
business of selling prints?
It's easier than you think it is. Art buyers are not lab animals grown in caves by evil scientists that only show up at fancy galas and then crawl back into. They're ordinary people. They're everywhere. You've seen 100 million of them. They're ordinary people. If you've ever been inside someone's home and you saw a beautiful photograph printed on their wall, boom, you just found an art buyer. Now, there's obviously different levels of art buyers. I've sold $2,500 prints that are massive, 2 meters, 3 meters by 6 meters, like just absolutely insanely large. Maybe not that big. What's 2.5 by 3? Yeah, 2.5 meters by 3 meters. Huge canvas, printed custom for them. So I've done that. I've done $14,000 sales of like many acrylic panels in a financial advisory's office in a rich suburb of Nashville. But most of my sales have been between $40 and $300. Canvas, paper, small metals or acrylics, and people love to have them in their offices, over a couch, over a bed, in their living room, in their kitchen. And ordinary people typically have three. They have three criteria for somebody to buy art. Ready? They have to have an emotional, strong connection with the subject matter that you're shooting. So it's either their hometown or somewhere where they've gone to. I can't believe how many pictures of Nashville that I've shipped to Australia, that I've shipped to England, like people from Switzerland buy San Francisco pictures. Like there's tons of cross-pollination. So element number one, they have to have a strong emotional connection with the subject matter that you're shooting. Number two, you need to have a little bit of disposable money, disposable income, a couple $100 that you can spend on something that you don't need to feed your children and keep your lights on, right? If you're struggling to keep the lights on, you're not going to buy art, but someone who's at least able to spend a few $100s. And the third thing is has control over their walls, meaning, if you can have all the money you want, but if you're living in a hotel, you don't really have control of your walls because you're constantly moving. But if you're a homeowner or a renter and you get the say of what goes up on your walls, boom, you're an art buyer. How do you find these people? They're everywhere. They are the general population. I find people 30 years and older tend to be the best buyers. So I don't market on TikTok. Um, yeah, Etsy.com is easily the best place to start. I've helped dozens and dozens and dozens of photographers go from never having sold art before to making 50 sales, 100 sales, 200 sales. I just had my first student hit 1,000 sales ever just on Etsy.com. It's
So
tens of thousands of dollars.
when you start on something like Etsy, like how many images do you have to have on your Etsy site? Is there a lower limit or an upper
10,
limit?
15?
10, 15? All right,
Yeah,
that sounds reasonable.
10 to 15 to start with, and then you kind of learn as you go, and later you'll have more judgment on what later ones. I find if someone puts 200, it takes them 6 months, and by the time they finish uploading, they realize that the first half that they've uploaded are all crap or something like that. So 10 to 15 to start with, and then add 3 a week is a great cadence to having a nice little side income on Etsy.
I mean, talking about Etsy, obviously Etsy is a great platform. Are there other platforms that you use outside of Etsy?
Yeah, great question. So I like Etsy the best by far because they're the most artist friendly. They're sort of like the Amazon.com, but for handy goods.
Yeah.
And Etsy is a lot larger in the US than it is in the UK, for example, but it does still work in the UK. It works in, 50, 100 different countries. I've shipped to Japan, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, Switzerland, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Italy,
So,
Germany, Canada.
so that's a question. So let's say when you say you ship to let's say Australia, do you do you have the image printed in Australia and then it gets shipped out there, or do you print it in the US and then ship it over?
I have a network of printers all over the world that have really, really good pricing for my students. And so there's no need to print something in Canada and ship it to Australia. You might as well print it, send the digital image to the Australian printer, and then they ship it 100 miles instead of 7,000 miles. It's better for the planet as well.
Yeah. And much cheaper, obviously. Um, okay, so okay, Etsy. What are the other platforms?
So I say start on Etsy, get up to 50 sales, and then after you've hit 50 sales on Etsy, get into eBay. eBay is a great platform, underrated actually. There's something called Amazon Handmade, which is an Amazon selling program that doesn't cost $40 a month to be part of, like normal Amazon is. So it's free to start, and yeah, you're connected to the world of Amazon, and it's a little harder to get on. There's more regulations. It's a little trickier than Etsy. There's more things to learn, but once you've hit 50 sales on Etsy, definitely Amazon Handmade's fine. eBay's great. There's a place called Fine Art America. It's very simple to get started. It's not nearly as big as Etsy. So Etsy is kind of the sweet spot of like, it doesn't have the biggest audience, but it has a pretty big audience. It's a little harder than Fine Art America, but you'll make more sales on it. It's way easier than Amazon. Anyway, Etsy is kind of like that. It kind of checks all the boxes to start with, and then as you get more and more advanced, there's other places where you can sell. There's a place called Wayfair. I haven't really done much on Wayfair. You can also sell on your own like Shopify site if you want. One thing I like doing is having different price tiers for different audiences. So let's say like a canvas is $200 on Etsy and Amazon, but then it's $500 on my own website. And then if I really want to help someone out, be like, you know what, here's a 60% off coupon to bring it down to the cost that you would otherwise have paid on Etsy.
I like Etsy a lot. In fact, yeah, at the beginning of the pandemic, it came in really handy. In fact, the desk behind me, I found a guy, near Brighton, in fact, who was building like handmade desks, tabletops, cut from trees, essentially, out of the back, in a workshop at the back of the garden. And I love the things like rough edges, is exactly what I was looking for. And I kind of immediately I thought like, you know what? After it's the pandemic, I work more from home. I need to upgrade my desk. I could just order from, I don't know, IKEA or something, right? Or I could actually just support a local business. Why not? And it was brilliant. It took absolutely forever because it was a pandemic. It took forever to get shipped, but that's great.
I love it. And there's hundreds of thousands of people out there who think just like you, who love supporting local. And small business, and it's
Yeah.
a great platform. They're very artist friendly too. Amazon's a little trickier. They're a little tougher. Etsy, they're a great place to start. Highly recommend it.
There's so many unique things I've found as well. I mean, everything from like, handmade leather goods, for example, you can't get anywhere else and stuff. It's actually a very cool place. Um, uh, and with that, talking about the sort of more premium feel, do you think like long exposure images sort of add to that premium feel when it comes to images?
Yeah, it feels less like a snapshot. Feels less like a cell phone picture. It feels more like, a work of art, fine art.
Because the reason I'm saying is because, your general punter, let's say, wouldn't necessarily be able to create that kind of imagery themselves. So therefore, by definition, it already has, or they wouldn't think of doing it. Let's say, I mean, although
it sets you apart. It's a really easy way to set you apart. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Tripods are $50, by the way. You can put a cell phone on a tripod and do long exposures with an iPhone. It's not actually that hard. Get a Lightroom. Shoot in RAW. That's very important. Shoot in RAW, not JPEG. Edit in Lightroom. Watch some Serge Ramelli tutorials on how to edit in Lightroom, and you're off to the races. You can get from zero to a fine art image in a few weeks with an iPhone and a $30 tripod. It doesn't actually. It's just a little bit more time, a little bit more calculation, and it sets long exposure definitely sets you apart from the average person.
And if you want to create some interesting angles, make sure you get a platypod, the sponsor of today's episode. There you have it.
Oh, I love those. Yeah, I've used those a lot.
What keeps you creatively inspired when photographing cities that, for all intents and purposes, have been photographed a million times before, like like London, like Paris? Is it sort of a sense of competition, or what inspires you about those places? Or to keep going back,
I could care less about competition. When I imagine the other photographers competing against me to sell the same thing, the same person, I wish the best. I wish other photographers the absolute best. I'm constantly, helping other photographers sell as well, which creates competition for me, and I couldn't care less. I'll tell you two very quick stories. I sold my first picture ever in April or May 2013, and it changed my life. Lady came in, said, "How much is that?" I hadn't even thought of pricing it. I was like, $60, a little 8x10 and a little frame. She's like, "I'll take it." I'm thinking, like, what? And then she's about to hand me her credit card. She's like, "Wait, how much is that one over there with like the accompanying piece?" And I'm like, "That's also $60. And she paused. She's like, "Would you take two for $100?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'll do that." So I ended up swiping her credit card. Because in America, we have sales tax separate from like VAT or whatever. So it was $109.75 because $109.25. Swiped her card for $109.25, and she thanked me so much. And I was so like nervous and scared. This is 12, 13 years ago. I was so nervous and scared that I didn't even tell her I was a photographer. I was like, "Oh yeah, a talented local photographer." She's like, "Oh, that's so cool." And I remember like her walking away and like I could barely breathe. And I was like, that was so fun. I don't drink. I've never done drugs, but like you hear about it in movies, like chasing a high or whatever. It's like that feeling was like the highest high imaginable. And I sold over 10,000 photographic prints face to face over the next 6-7 years. I can only do it online now, but the thousands of people who would look at a picture and just gasp and be like, "Oh my gosh, that's my hometown, but taken professionally. Thank you so much for doing it justice. I've seen this of New York. I've seen this of Chicago. I've seen this of London and Paris. I've never seen it of Nashville, Tennessee. Thank you so much. How much is that? $500. I pay double that. Here's my money." Oh my God. So I love the effect that creates. So I'm always thinking of the end user. I couldn't care less about, I don't even consider competition. I consider them fellow artists who are, trying to make something beautiful. And, so yeah, I've seen thousands of people just like freeze, they're walking through a mall. They see my picture. They're like, "Oh my gosh, I need to have that up on our wall." And I mean, that's just, if I can bring joy. And here's the thing. Selling photography that's really beautiful is such a good value proposition for the other person because they pay one time and they have a lifetime subscription to beauty. And every time they walk in the room, they're smiling. And the amount of emails I've gotten from people 5 years after they bought some $100 thing from me in a mall in 2019 is unbelievable. And people still follow me from years and years. Many years later, I'll be in a foreign country and they're like, I met you in a mall in 2018 and I knew you were going to play or whatever, right? But like, it really creates an amazing experience. I think it's such good value for money for them. And because I've been told that many times. So that feeling of spreading happiness, spreading joy, spreading inspiration, making other people's homes more beautiful. Because there's been tons of studies made that when there's art in a city, there's less crime. And one great way of reducing crime in any area is to make it beautiful. Pick up the trash, you know, trim the hedges, trim the grass, put murals up on the walls, and crime goes down. When you make when you hit people with beauty, it brings more happiness, and happier people commit less crime. Everything goes up. I'll never forget in 2021, a gentleman walked by. He was maybe in his late 60s, and he was a little introverted. He was a little shy and kind of stood around for 10 minutes. And he came up to me and he's like, "Hey, can I share a little something?" I'm like, "Sure." He goes, I'm a war veteran. I think he was in Iraq or something, or maybe the Gulf War 30 years ago, because he was older now. And he goes, sometimes, I get depressed. Sometimes, I hate to admit it, but, I think about, just ending it all sometimes. But I see that beautiful picture up on that wall. And it saved me more than once. Now I'm frozen. I'm like, oh my gosh, like, I'm just a dude taking pictures, like, my gosh. So I don't say that to aggrandize or anything like that, but I'm like, artists in the world, from a session musician like you to a photographer, we're not just taking pretty pictures. We're positively impacting people emotionally. And I remember growing up, if you ask most kids when they're 12 or 13, what do you want to do? And what do you want to do? Typical answer was like, I want to help people. I want to change the world. I want to make the world a better place. Artists actually do that. And so I am humbled and very grateful to be an artist. That's what I do. Not to compete with other people who do the same thing. Like, I'm so happy. If I can empower 10,000 more of me to get even more beauty in the world, maybe we can reduce crime even further. Maybe we can make people happy. Maybe we can lessen depression just that little bit. Maybe we can inspire the world to make a better tomorrow. If you look at 200 years ago, people were kind of subsisting, like they barely had enough money to eat generally across the world. And now we have, because of technology, we have a little bit of an ability to pick up our chin and say, what do we actually want to do in life? What could the world look like in 50 years when a good chunk of the world could be employed as artists and inspire the world? Especially with the advent of AI, people value human connection even more. So if in the 1800s we went from farming to industry, and then in the 20th, 21st century we went from industry to service, maybe we can go from service to creativity, because AI is coming, and one thing that will always be precious is individual talent and individual artistic creation. And, I'd love to be a small part of that revolution, to turn more people into artists who can actually get their art out there and be paid for their work in a fair way, and have a side gig, or who knows, one day even do it full time. That's my life mission. I'm 33 years old. I have a good 30, 40, 50 years ahead of me. That's kind of all I want to do.
I love that. That's fantastic, and it's so true. Actually, it's this moment when you see somebody else emotionally react to your work. No matter whether it's a photograph or a piece of music or whatever it is. That's the thing. I remember this, of course. Seeing the response. When, let's say, you've slaved over writing a piece of music and you recorded it, and then you play to somebody and they listen to it for the first time and you see that response. It's unbelievable. Or when people tell you after the fact, I've always listened to the song when I'm doing this, or oh, it reminds me of that. That's phenomenal. And the same thing, actually, weirdly, in my headshot business, it's exactly the same thing, because every single person that comes through my door for a headshot session, without fail, will say, I hate having my photo taken, or I'm totally unphotogenic. So, they come in with that negative experience already. Yeah. And I always say this, I said this millions of times, was, and this is one of the things I talk about to other photographers, for example. The thing about headshot photography is, in my view, creating a great looking headshot, that's not my superpower. I think that's base level. basically. If you're a professional photographer, a professional headshot photographer, that's you should be doing that. You should be able to create great looking headshots. I mean, that's kind of your job, you know. If you're like, you know, if you call yourself a baker and you set up a bakery, you know,
Bill
baking,
Baker.
yeah, being able to bake decent bread is sort of that's baseline, right? Um, my superpower, you know, my job in a sense is to turn people from I hate having my photo taken to when they leave saying, I had a really great experience. This was really fun. You know, I loved it. If I can do that, you know, that's mission accomplished. And a massive part of that is when the first time, because, you know, so what I do is they go into my shooting space and we shoot. And then at some point, I get them to come to the screen and we look through some of the images. And I do that periodically. So, you know, we shoot a little bit, I get them back to the screen, we shoot a bit more and so on. Um, the first time they come to the screen and they see themselves properly lit, professionally shot, you know, professionally posed on a beautiful 5K screen, they would have never seen themselves photographed in that way ever before, most likely, you know. And it's that microsecond of total wonder, you know, where they just go, the jaw drops and they go, wow, you know, that's the moment, you know, exactly. That's exactly the moment that makes it totally worthwhile. You know, yes, they pay the bills and all the rest of it,
Yeah.
but
It's that emotional pay where it's like, this is what I wake up at 4 a.m. for. This
yeah,
is why my fingers bleed for the guitar. This is why I invested $4,000 in a camera. This is
absolutely.
why I gave up a career. Anything else. Yeah. Oh, I'm totally with it. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's so true. You know, I think most artists, you know, most creatives, that's really, you know, that's a major part of the reason why they're doing it. I don't think anybody does art to make money. Yeah, I mean, maybe there's some people, but the vast majority of people do art because they feel compelled to doing it. You know, it's the same. I mean, it's of course the same in music. I remember, you know, when I graduated from music college and then decided to, you know, work on a career in music, you know, you wouldn't believe how many people, especially my German family, you know, how many people would say like, "Oh, are you sure you want to do that? Do you want to like, do you want to study like, I don't know, medicine or something, you know, or engineering or something, you know, a proper job." Um, and you know, I never understood why people could say that until you know much later on, when I realized that the thing about creativity and creative people is it's not that you don't really have a choice. If you're compelled to do something, there's an inner thing that compels you or forces you almost to do that. You can't stop. You can't stop thinking about it. You can't, you know, you sleep, breathe, and live photography or you know whatever your art is, and that is just you know that's just the way it is. Which is why you know when we talked earlier about sleeping on floors and stuff. I never cared about that. You know, my parents were horrified. I remember the first time, you know, my parents came over to London when I was sharing an apartment. Um, it was the first time they came over, and they were sort of, I don't think they were buying the horror stories that I used to tell them when you know, when I would talk to them. Um,
Yeah.
you know, because to be fair, you know, my background is probably it's like straight you know straight up middle class, I would say, if you would call it that. You know, my parents weren't super mega wealthy, but they were also weren't poor. I had a really good childhood. I had a great upbringing in the south of Germany. Um, you know, it was fantastic. Um, so you know, but when the first time they came over, and they came to my apartment, and my mom said, "Oh, you know, I just want to let's just see what music students have in the fridge or something, you know." And she opens the fridge and I kid you not, there's nothing in it. It was completely empty because we didn't have any money to buy any food, you know. And my mom just flipped, you know. She flipped and she grabbed both me and my roommate, dragged us to the local Tesco's, which is like a you know like a
Grocery store.
yeah like a Target equivalent or whatever, a grocery store thing and she just filled up our fridge. That was the first thing she did. And you know, but it's this thing where like a lot of people wouldn't necessarily understand why you would do that. You know, why would you leave a really well paid job to do this with that risk? Well, you know, who in their right mind would do that? Why would you, you know, not go and study something that has some kind of promise of stable income or something, why would you rely on something that's as insecure and unpredictable as anything, as music or photography or acting?
Because we can't do anything but. I remember when I sold that first 2 pictures to that first lady, I'm like, as she was walking away, I mean, I was over the moon. Like my whole body was sweating. I was like, I couldn't believe what just happened. But as I came down, like as my heart rate like normalized, I was like, well, I guess I don't have a 6-figure job anymore because this is the only thing I want to do.
Yeah.
I knew I had just lost my job because I'm like, there's no way I'm getting up and working. I was working 75, 80-hour weeks. I do 90-hour weeks sometimes, month after month. Like, there's one year where I had like a day and a half off in the entire year. Other than that, it was like 10 to 9 every single day, 11 hours a day. And I was making good money and I was happy and I was investing in like, my artist career. But the second I made that first sale, I was like, yeah, I'm toast. I can't get myself out of bed in the morning if it's not to do this. So I know what you mean, man.
See, that's that immediately sounds, from a European perspective, like with socialized healthcare and like workers' rights and all that kind of, that's 90 hour weeks. That immediately sounds horrible. Yeah, screw that. I wouldn't do that.
Allegedly, all of this is alleged.
I know. All right, cool. So, what advice would you give photographers who want to build a long-term print business from their art? What would be your one piece of advice?
Get in a community where you don't feel comfortable. Get in a community where people are already achieving what you want to achieve, where you see the unquestioning evidence. Every day you're reminded that guy just sold that girl just sold that, this person just shipped a $700 thing to Colorado, this person just sent this to New Zealand. Get yourself in a community that overwhelming evidence that you can overcome the current hurdle that you're at. Because there's hurdles at every level. As you know, probably from a musician, as a photographer, when you're trying to like book your first gig, there's hurdles there. When you're trying to like quit your day job and get stable, there's hurdles there. When you're stable but you're at a plateau, there's hurdles at every point, and that's just kind of how life is. Being in a community of people who are better than you, I shouldn't say better, more advanced in the journey, have been doing it for longer than you, that make you a little bit internally uncomfortable because you compare yourself to them and you're like, what are they doing right that I'm not? And then you figure out what they're doing right, and then you copy their results. Getting in a community is the best piece of advice I ever got.
Fantastic.
There's a 1 in 100 chance you know this person, but you're German, he's German. Do you know Felix Kunz?
Oh, the name rings a bell.
Okay, he's a German-British photographer. He actually went to the same school as I. He's very famous now. He worked for Annie Leibovitz for some years.
Oh, maybe that's okay.
You should interview him for your podcast. He's a world renowned. I got to be an assistant for him while he did photography in New York City when I was like 21 years old, and I just got to see a master at work. And he would have been like 29 at the time. I would have been like 20, and that's a big difference. He had been a professional for 10 years, and I was just getting started, and just kind of seeing that level of competence, seeing how he spoke with clients, and I was the guy that would lug 110 pounds of lighting gear through the subway to southern Manhattan, and like it was, I had the time of my life with him. But seeing somebody up close, or even in an online community, who is ahead of you just completely accelerates by decades. Meeting Sergio Melli, seeing how established he was, and he gave me lots of tips and tricks, like took decades out of my life. So kind of like what you're doing. You're building community with this podcast. Get in a community where people are further along in the journey than you, a couple chapters ahead, and you'll never be the same again.
Fantastic advice. I actually completely agree. Again, on a side note, my dad, who was also a drummer, he used to say to me when I was a kid, right? He used to say to me, if you really want to get good, always be in a band where all the other members are better than you are. Because it just pushes you on. If you're the best player in a band, forget about it. You're not going to get any better. Everybody else is going to ride on your coattails, and that's it. And you constantly, everything's going to slow you down all the time. But if you're in a band where you feel like you're the weakest link in the band, you're going to work your ass off to stay in that band. And that's exactly it.
It works in art, it works in career, it works in sports teams too. If you're the worst player on the team, you're gonna better.
Absolutely, yeah. And you know, I remember I lived in New Orleans for a little while, in the early '90s, or yeah, early mid '90s, um, and uh, and you know, when I moved to New Orleans, it's like a like an exchange program, um, and I thought, I thought I was a pretty decent guitar player, you know. I mean, I thought at the time I was like, in my little town, I was definitely
Not on purpose.
not on freaking Bourbon Street. Oh, what an eye opener that was! That was a life lesson. I tell you, like I mean, every dude, like, is sitting by a lamppost playing on like a guitar that had three strings missing would play me completely under the table. It was unbelievable. It's just like, okay, well, this is where it's at.
I have a three. I have a three-dimensional movie in my head playing of exactly what you're describing. I know Bourbon Street very well.
Yeah, yeah, it was unbelievable. I mean, especially at the time, one of the things I absolutely loved about Bourbon Street, apart from the food, I'm like, I'm a complete Cajun food nerd. But what I loved at the time was like, there were so many bars that had like open fronts, and there would be bands playing in each one of those bars, and you just walk down the street and there would be music coming out from every corner. And I was like, as a musician at the time, I was like, this is freaking cool. There's a bar, a friend of mine took me to this uptown bar, where a guy called Walter Wolfman Washington was playing. And I mean, I was like, he recently died actually not too long ago, but um, it was the most insane gig I ever seen in a bar. Like, what the hell? It was like the full on horn section. The guy was going nuts. It was unbelievable. Um, yeah, we ended up sitting at the bar until the place shut down in the end. Just talking guitars and music and things like that. So again, the best, much better education. I mean, I went to music college after that, um, which was cool. But there isn't any better education as you get than on the street, basically. Unbelievable.
Yeah. And
Anyway,
it's interesting in the middle of the Renaissance, you had apprenticing. How did Michelangelo sculpting? Well, he was a gift from God. But other than that, he learned it from apprenticing. And if you look at like the philosophers of ancient Greece, if like I always forget the order of these. Well, what are Plato? Mentored Aristotle. I'm probably getting fun, but the Aristotle, you know, advised Alexander the Great, and it's like in like mentorship in groups and in-person apprenticeship. And yeah, formal education is great. It gets you the degrees, it gets you the certifications that make sure everybody can build a bridge that won't collapse. But especially in the arts, groups, communities, nothing beats it.
yeah, nobody, in 20 years of being a session musician, nobody's ever asked me for my diploma or anything. It's just not a thing. You rock up at a studio, it's what you can do on a guitar. Nobody cares whether, you've studied at university or at college or whatever or not. Nobody cares. Nobody gives a shit. It's basically, right, here you go. That's the track, play, go. And that's all that matters.
PhD in musicology does not pay the rent, does it?
Not at all. Not at all. Or maybe you could get a teaching job more easily. I guess that's probably the difference. All right, cool. Let's finish this off with a quick fire round. 6 questions, super quick.
Yeah.
All right, here we go. Prime lens or zoom for cityscapes?
Prime for quality, zoom for convenience. In the last 4 years, I have become the thing that I always hated and feared. I now shoot with a 24-70, but for the first 10 years, prime all the way.
Oh my God. Have you had the chance to check out Nikon's brand new, just the latest, most recent S-Line 24-70 2.8?
Not that. No, I'm on G Master.
Oh, I've literally just recently got that lens. I literally like maybe a week and a half ago. It is literally the most insane lens I have ever shot. This thing is unbelievable, both for stills and video, by the way. It's unbelievable. Incredible.
Wow. 2.8, something like that?
Yeah, it's 2.8, yeah. It's basically it's a standard pro lens, 24-70, 2.8. But it's an internal zoom, so there's, it works fantastically well for video. It has a very beautifully cinematic way of changing focus, from, let's say, foreground to background. It literally feels like you have a manual focus puller. It doesn't just go zoop, to the next to the next object. It just does it in a really nice, really cinematic way. It's phenomenal. And because it's not, it's not like a telescopic zoom. It works fantastically well on gimbals and things because you don't have that weight shift. It's just a fantastic lens. Anyway, question number 2: your favorite city in the world to photograph?
Oof! I'm gonna upset myself and a lot of people here. Paris was the first one that came to mind. Oh, Paris and New York City are having a fist fight in my head right now. Man, Paris beats New York City by a micrometer.
Guess what Serge's answer was to this question?
New York?
Which is Paris. Upset.
Paris. Okay, fair enough. I'd say Kyoto, Japan would get an honorable third as well.
Cool. Long exposure or natural shutter? Which one do you reach for instinctively?
Long exposure, not even close.
Cool. One print you've sold that you'd keep forever. Which is it?
Ooh. I took a picture called Ghost Town Broadway that I've sold $800 to $1,000 worth of that one photograph. It gave me my entire career. I shot during the pandemic. Nobody on Broadway, where there's normally thousands of people on Broadway. I made a TV appearance. I was on the radio. It changed my life in a very big way, and it allowed me to launch the Left Driving Artistic Academy. So I would say, I'd say Ghost Town Broadway.
Cool. What's your biggest photography pet peeve?
Ooh. Okay, this is an odd one. I teach thousands of people how to sell their photography. I also love teaching photography, but I don't do it. Like I don't teach courses on how to do photography. I just teach in a community on how to sell photography. When there's somebody who's bright and new and doesn't know the basics of photography, I want to pause everything I'm doing in life and just spend 3 days with them and teach them everything about photography. And I don't have the time because there's going to be hundreds of people that I would need to help like that. I'd never get anything done. So yeah, seeing somebody who I can see they have the vision, they have the desire to learn, and I can't just park my entire life and sit down in a cafe with them for 3 days in a row, 8 hours apiece, and just teach them everything I know. That's it's a weird answer, but it's my sincere answer.
Okay, cool. Last question. If you could shoot one iconic landmark with 0 tourists around, which one would you choose?
That's a great question. Oh, man. Okay. I have rented out the pyramids for February 2026. I'm bringing 17 people to Cairo, and I spent $40,000 to $45,000 in permitting to rent out the entire pyramids at sunset. They kick you out 2 hours before sunset otherwise. So I'm doing a sunset, a sunrise, and a middle of the night with the stars and the Milky Way above the pyramids. I would have to say the pyramids with no one there, from the right angle, and no one around at sunset with perfect lighting. That'd be my go-to.
Wouldn't it totally suck if it was overcast on that day?
I'll make it work no matter what.
Yeah. Fantastic. Craig, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show, man. Thank you so much for being the guest on the Camera Shake podcast. That's it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed diving into the art, craft, and business behind Craig Alexander's incredible long exposure cityscapes. If you haven't already, make sure you join the Shake Squad over at camerashakepodcast.com so you don't miss the good stuff we've got coming your way. And there's a lot of stuff that's coming your way. So make sure you sign up for that newsletter over there. And if you'd like to support the show, hit like and subscribe. And you can buy us a coffee over at buymeacoffee.com/camerashake. It helps us keep bringing your conversations with the world's best photographers out there. Thanks so much for hanging out with us today. I'm Kirsten Nuts. This is Camera Shake, and I'll see you next Thursday right here for another Shakeout.